when the Kennedy stood up, the bullet was on the rear seat where she had been sitting, where I first thought I picked it up.
3 bedrooms. Bobby and Jackie occupied the third, in which there was one king-sized bed, and as she put it, you could hear the sound of their love-making all night long.
So the idea that his own government would be doing business with the mob outraged him. That's where Bobby immediately cast his suspicion. He thought this plot against the president had come out of the CIA mafia operation.
Marilyn gets the idea that they're going to pass her around, and she basically says, look, they're using me as a piece of meat. She went ahead and said, listen, I'm going to go to the press.
Welcome back to the Theme Machine. I'm John Carney. Glad you've decided to catch another episode of the program, or maybe you're just starting here. No matter. Glad you've joined us anyway. And this time around, we head to Camelot. No dynasty, especially in the world of politics, has captured the imagination like the Kennedy family. A family deeply entrenched in the world of politics, from presidents and senators to ambassadors, and most recently, the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Along with rising up the political ranks, the family's also been fraught with a fair amount of tragedy and what's come to be known as the Kennedy curse, a concept that was introduced by Ted Kennedy after the Chappaquiddick incident in which a woman lost her life in that car Ted was driving. Certainly the assassination of John and Robert were the best known tragedies, but Michael was killed in a skiing accident, and of course John Jr. perished in a plane crash in 1999. We'll hear about some of those events as well as other events and stories surrounding members of that family from some of the people who have studied them for years and some of the people that were there. There's no question that we are incredibly fascinated by that family. Former MSNBC host of Hardball, Chris Mathews, has written extensively on the family and speculates as to why we're so interested.
You know, for all the presidents we've had, there's very few who are interested in their backstory. I mean, even Obama, I don't think people are particularly interested in his personal life or what he did before he was president, or even particularly interested in him personally. I think true with Reagan even. People loved Reagan, of course, but they didn't have any fascination with him as a person. There's 2 presidents that I think people have been fascinated with personally, since Roosevelt, of course, and that's Kennedy and Nixon. I think Nixon, there's always going to be a fascination with that guy. What made him tick? What was he about? And the same with Jack Kennedy and Bobby. I think they just, certain people like Hemingway or Churchill, that we find fascinating as individuals, and at least I do. And I'm not interested in Jerry Ford's lifetime or growing up or playing football at Michigan. I don't care. I don't care about Woodrow Wilson. But I do care about the Kennedys. I think their life of the rich Irish, the whole thing with the mob, with the Bobby going after Giancana and Jack sleeping with a mob ball, basically, Judy Campbell, the whole thing fighting Castro. I think it's a hell of a story. I know this when I go out to a crowd. I've done a lot on this book tour with Bobby Kennedy. First of all, Bobby Kennedy has outsold my Jack Kennedy book.
June 5th, 1968, Bobby Kennedy gets gunned down in the kitchen of a hotel, and he certainly believed to be that he most likely would have become president of the United States. And a lot of conversation about it now, not just because of the anniversary and not just because of your book, but one of his kids stirring it up and bringing forth the possibility that, not unlike Uncle Jack, there was another conspiracy and another shooter, and it was not just Sirhan in the kitchen. In fact, he even went to go visit Sirhan, which I didn't even realize was still alive, and bringing up these questions. Where do you weigh in on this?
My only question, first of all, on Jack Kennedy, there's no way that it could have been a conspiracy, because it's Terry Bruno, who wrote after the assassination. He was the head of advance that day. They didn't have the motorcade route set until the day before. You know, Oswald had been working in that place for months and in a book depository, and he'd gone out and tried to shoot the right-wing General Edwin Walker. According to his wife, Maureen, he was going out to shoot Nixon. He had his gun. He was just a guy, a bit of a crackpot who loved Castro, out looking to get somebody on the right. And he thought Kennedy was on the right against Castro, which he was. On the other hand, I talked to a guy when I was out on my book tour who watched him shoot 6 of his bullets right at Bobby, and all those guys like Rayford Johnson, all those guys that were there, Barry and the rest of us, the former FBI guy working for the Kennedys, they all saw it happen. So, this idea of a second shooter, the idea that there's synchronized shooting, that there's some guy that just showed up and just is the split second this guy in the kitchen managed to get close to Kennedy. He was right there and began shooting just in the same fusillade of bullets. I mean, come on. I don't believe it.
That's Chris Mathews, and this is the Theme Machine. I'm John Carney. This week it's the Kennedys, and some of this episode will cover the assassination of the president for sure, and much has been written and theorized about that. Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who served under 5 presidents, was assigned to the First Lady during the Kennedy administration. His book back in 2012, Mrs. Kennedy and Me, talks about how he was privy to many of the first family's private moments, even though it was a detail he didn't want to begin with.
I was very, very upset. I didn't want that assignment. I wanted to be assigned to the president because I knew that's where, under previous administrations, that's where the actual.
Tell me about the first encounter with the First Lady.
First met her just shortly after the election in 1960. I went over to meet her at their residence in Georgetown, and she was a very attractive, very poised, wonderful lady, extremely pregnant. We gradually got to know each other and got to respect each other and trust each other. It worked out. We became very close professionally, and we worked very well together.
What about protocol? Because you were around world leaders and because you were with these big celebrities and because you were in the company of the President of the United States in this family on a regular basis, what were some of the things that you were instructed not to do or say?
Well, our job was to provide a safe environment for the protectee, the President, or Mrs. Kennedy in this case, to do whatever they wanted to do, provided we could keep them safe. And I wanted to be able to afford her the opportunity to do those things she loved, like riding horses or water skiing or playing tennis. And the president himself, he loved to sail. He wanted to be out on a sailboat. And he also wanted to swim in the ocean among the sharks occasionally. So that was rather difficult to arrange or protect, but we managed.
And it's good practice for Washington, I guess.
I guess you could say that.
It's been my experience in talking to people who have covered or knew people of that stature and that ilk, that it's a pretty lonely life in the sense that you're never really alone. You never stop. You're never not on. Did she ever talk to you about her feelings of the constant limelight and the pressures of being the First Lady?
She really loved her privacy. And that's one of the reasons we spent a lot of time in Middleburg, where she could get away from the crowds in the city and the activities during the White House, and she could go out and she could ride. She really relished her private time with she and the children and the president.
What did we find you doing after you left the Kennedy detail?
I was returned to the White House detail and eventually became the special agent in charge of presidential protection during the Johnson administration. And then I was moved up into headquarters eventually and became the assistant director for all protective forces.
So that took you out of the field, right?
Took me over to headquarters. The responsibility was greater because I had more people to worry about.
I would think, though, it's kind of like a situation with an astronaut that once you go on a rocket hundreds of miles an hour and you leave the Earth and you go to another planet, when you come back, it's really hard to find anything that excites you. Was it difficult to adjust to that, to be more an administrative role?
Yes, I didn't care for the administrative part of it at all. In fact, it gave me too much time to think, and I thought about what had happened that day in Dallas, and that caused me to become depressed more and more.
That's Clint Hill, and this is the Theme Machine. We'll hear from Mr. Hill again a bit later on. And along with ample tragedy, the Kennedys certainly had their share of scandals as well. Some proven and others speculation. One that probably got the most attention was Marilyn Monroe's tie to the family. Some of that was fueled by her now infamous sultry rendition of Happy Birthday to the president. Best-selling author and investigative reporter Mark Shaw presented that case in his book, Collateral Damage.
So I looked at Jack Kennedy in that relationship, but that relationship was short-lived, you remember, because Joe Kennedy basically said JFK ended. And so then I thought, wait a minute, could it be Bobby Kennedy? I did not know that she had a relationship with Bobby Kennedy. And so I looked into that, and boy, it just exploded my research. Because, for instance, I found that Gene Kennedy Smith had written a letter to Marilyn saying, hey, I understand you and Bobby are the new item. When he comes back to the East Coast, why don't you come with him? And then I found a CIA document. Robert Kennedy has been having a romance and a sex affair with over a period of time with Marilyn Monroe. And so I looked into that. And what really startled me, though, was the fact that when I found out that Marilyn, who was in great spirits, except for Bobby being a thorn in her side, had actually told her that he was going to divorce Ethel and marry her. And then all at once, just like JFK had done when he dumped her, Bobby Kennedy did the same thing. And I have this visual in the book that I hope people will look at. Marilyn Monroe did not deserve to die. And she wasn't a dumb blonde. She was smart. Hell, she read Ulysses, which I could never read. And she loved the intellectual part of being with the Kennedy. And now she's got the Attorney General saying he's going to divorce his wife, and all at once she can't get in touch with him. Think of her sitting by the phone as she calls the Attorney General's office. I have her telephone book, and there's the number for the Attorney General. And she called, and the secretary says, well, he's not available. I'm sure she cried her eyes out. And so then there was this party that happened up at the hotel on the Nevada-California border. The two Kennedys were there, Frank Sinatra, others. But Marilyn gets the idea that they're going to pass her around. And she basically says, look, they're using me as a piece of meat. And she made the biggest mistake she could make. She went ahead and said, listen, I'm going to go to the press. I'm going to tell all. And that's in a CIA document released on August 3rd, 1962, the day before Marilyn died. Subject threatened to hold a press conference and would tell all. But worse than that is the situation where she said, where it says, subject, Marilyn, made reference to her knowing about bases in Cuba and also knew of the president's plan to kill Castro. Can you imagine if that would have been exposed to the media? And so the Kennedys, Bobby Kennedy just had to be almost having a heart attack that she would do that. The problem with showing that he had involvement with her death was that he had an alibi. He was in San Francisco. I proved that was wrong. He landed a helicopter at 20th Century Fox on the day she died. And he and Peter Lawford, I show, went to Marilyn's home and begged her, please don't go to the media. And when she refused, she said, I'm going to tell everything about you guys, how you used me and everything else, and crying and all of that. And they left. And a reliable witness at the time told me the moment that she refused to do it, she was dead.
That's Mark Shaw, and this is The Theme Machine. I'm John Carney. Seems to be no real shortage of theories about this family, and we haven't even gotten to the president's assassination. In fact, we have more theories about lesser-known relationships, too, but we'll get to that later on. Although his presidential term was short-lived, JFK's accomplishments were extensive, like establishing the Apollo program and the Peace Corps. And there were a lot of back-channel events that were happening that we didn't really learn much about until years later. Writer-director Cory Taylor lays out many of those efforts in his 2013 documentary, JFK, A President Betrayed.
He risked enormous political capital to make some of these moves, and in many respects, I think became a threat to the status quo during the height of the Cold War. And I'm talking specifically about his efforts to dialogue with Nikita Khrushchev, with Fidel Castro, his efforts to open up a negotiating channel with the North Vietnamese and Ho Chi Minh. Some of these things have been hiding in the record in plain sight for decades, but they're not picked up by the media, and there's some really shocking and revelatory stories.
other aspects, too, that you get into with this fair amount of what ifs is we didn't see a second term from John F. Kennedy, but what if we had, and a very different face to the world, and certainly Vietnam would have gone differently. And talk about putting that together and shaping a future that wasn't.
What we really tried to do, audience members could make up their mind for themselves. I think there are so many details that this film presents that aren't generally known in the public. Looking at the material, there's strong evidence to support the belief that JFK was absolutely going to get out of Vietnam, that he had no intention of being there, that he'd been there visiting as a young congressman in the early 50s and was very much aware of the failed French effort to keep a hold of their colonies and the futility of military engagement there that didn't have the support of a genuine Vietnamese nationalist movement. These are some things that Kennedy was saying as early as 1951. So that, among other things, I had no idea before we did research that Kennedy was actually working through back channels to try and speak with Fidel Castro at a time when that was Cold War heresy. So the possibilities are significant, and it's a tragic loss. I think that what we tried to focus on the film was not evidence necessarily directly connected to the assassination, but what was the climate and how did JFK's overtures for peace make him threat to the status quo of the way things had been done previously. And, there are significant things in the record that indicate how volatile the situation was. And just for example, Dean Acheson had been an advisor to President Kennedy, and he was a former Secretary of State to Truman. And Acheson, giving advice to Kennedy was actively behind his back, also sort of running him down among colleagues in Washington. Now, this may be business as usual or an ordinary thing, but this guy was, he represented he was an elder statesman of the Democratic Party in one sense, was supposed to represent the base or Kennedy's base, and yet you find this sort of contentious criticism behind the president's back.
It's the Theme Machine. I'm John Carney. Thanks for joining us. This time around, it's all about the Kennedys. Obviously, we can't cover all of them, but another family member that the country couldn't hear enough about was John F. Kennedy Jr. From the image we all saw of young John saluting his father's funeral motorcade, to watching him grow up and become not a politician, but a magazine editor. The monthly magazine, George, was launched in 1995, and it was run with the help of John's chief of staff and confidant, Rosemarie Terenzino. One peek into John's life came in her book, JFK Jr., An Intimate Portrait.
A lot of us wondered why he didn't go the political route of his dad and his uncle and others.
Well, I think, there was certainly talk of it, and obviously there's a lot of hope for it, and I think it was something that he was considering, but I think he wanted it to be the right time, and he didn't want to run just based on his name. He wanted to make George Magazine a success first.
And you look at the list of people who contributed to this project besides yourself, from people you would expect, politicians and media people, but one of the songwriters of the Grateful Dead, and Mike Tyson, Larry Flint, and it certainly seemed like a strange array of bedfellows. For somebody that was with him a lot of the time, was that his world? Was the group around him always that eclectic?
Absolutely. John had a very eclectic group around him all the time, including some of his friends, who weren't in it. But if you look at the diversity of the group, it just goes to show, what kind of guy he was. He saw good things in different people. Ann Coulter, Mike Tyson, Christiane Amanpour, Cindy Crawford, Robert De Niro. Certainly is not your run-of-the-mill group.
Did he ever talk to you about, and I think this would be an issue of somebody like this who everybody wants a part of, trying to be able to discern who was being his friend because they liked him for who he was, and other people that just wanted to have JFK Jr. on their friend resume?
I think that he probably, he obviously dealt with a little bit of that, but he was pretty good at sussing that out quite early. He had a good sense of people. He was born famous, so he was famous his whole life. And by the time he was a young adult, I think he had a pretty good sense of who was in it for him and who was in it for the fame.
Yeah, not a lot of people, I think, could boast that the first home they remember was the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue.
Exactly. Yeah.
The magazine, George Magazine, actually, did that continue for a while after he died?
It did for a little while. It went on for a little while, and then it ended.
How did the two of you come to know each other?
I was working for his partner, Michael Berman, at a PR firm, and John started to come into the office, and we were all sort of perplexed as to why John F. Kennedy Jr. was coming in to our little PR office in Midtown, and then we realized that he was starting a magazine called George. So you see in the film a lot of how George started to come together and what it meant to him, and some of the George contributors that are in there, like Paul Begala and Ann Coulter, and how hands-on, and his friend Gary Ginsberg was part of the magazine, but you really do see in the documentary how hands-on he was as an editor.
And there's a fair amount of footage and stills in this documentary, I Am JFK Jr., that we haven't seen before, which is kind of shocking because, well, we're talking about a member of Camelot here, and I don't think there's been a more written about or scrutinized family.
No, it is. That's another, aside from the incredible cast and what they have to say about him, one of the great things about the film is the footage and the photos that you see that you've never seen before of him, as a child, but also as an adult.
Had we not tragically lost him in '99 to that plane crash, and this involves some speculation on your part, where do you think he would be professionally at this point?
I just have to say, given the political climate, but I think eventually he would have run for governor of New York, and then, maybe on back to the White House.
Rosemarie Terenzino on the Theme Machine. She also produced a documentary, by the way, called I Am JFK Jr. for Paramount. This episode of the Theme Machine could easily have been all about JFK's assassination, but we had other avenues we wanted to travel. I do want to delve into that a bit from someone you heard earlier, Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who was assigned to the First Lady, and yes, he was there in Dealey Plaza in 1963.
In the Zapruder film, you're captured for all history as the one that's climbing onto the back of the car to protect the First Lady, which was your role. What are some of the more clear memories of that moment in time in your head?
It was a beautiful day in Dallas. Big crowds, a lot of wonderful people. And when I heard that explosive noise in the right rear of the motorcade and saw that the president grabbing at himself and something had happened to him, my reaction was to immediately try to get to the presidential car and get myself up on top to form a shield between President and Mrs. Kennedy and whoever was trying to do them harm. I was just a little late in getting there. I was close, but I wasn't close enough.
Do you remember that initial thought of what had just happened, or was it completely instinctive?
It was just completely instinctive. It was strictly a reaction, reacting to the events that took place at that time.
And you rode in the car with her as they took the president to the hospital where he was later pronounced dead.
I placed myself up on top of the back of the car, over the top of Mrs. Kennedy and the president.
So was she, I'm sure, obviously she was in shock, but did she say anything?
She did say, they shot his head off. And then she said, "Oh, Jack, what have they done? What have they done to you?"
I can't imagine how you stay calm in a situation like that with someone you've grown close to. You've been on the detail for a few years at this point, that you are able to stay cold and not emotionally involved.
I was a little emotional. They tell me, I don't recall it, but they tell me that I was pounding on the trunk with my fist, and that I turned and gave a thumbs down to the other agents in the car behind us. So I was expressing some emotion in that regard.
I know you stayed with her through the election. Did it change your relationship with her?
No, not really. Probably were closer, but it was very difficult to be around she and the children and to realize what had happened. And the children's father was no longer there, and her husband was no longer there, and it was our job to protect them, and we had failed to do that.
Did you stay in touch with the First Lady?
Up until 1968, which is the last time I saw her, that was at Robert Kennedy's funeral.
Former Secret Service agent Clint Hill, who passed away earlier this year. Another Secret Service agent who was also in the middle of that historic moment in Dallas was Paul Landis. And in his book, The Final Witness, a Kennedy Secret Service agent breaks his silence after 60 years. Landis shares a couple of revelations in the book that turned more than a couple of heads.
There's been a lot of talk about this part of the book where you unveil the fact that at that scene in Daley Plaza, you found a bullet, put it in your pocket, and went to the hospital where they took the president and ended up setting that bullet on the stretcher so they would find it because it was probably a piece of evidence. Yet nobody asked you about it, and you didn't even get a call from the Warren Commission who were investigating this thing. That just seems weird to me, doesn't it?
Well, we reached Parkland Memorial Hospital, and I raced up to the president's limo, and I tried to help Mr. Kennedy out, and she refused my help. Clint Hill came around and opened the back door to the limousine, and when I went inside, after scanning the whole car, and when the Kennedy stood up, the bullet was on the back of the rear seat where she had been sitting, where I first thought and picked it up.
What about no phone call from the Warren Commission? I mean, I don't think there was a more exhaustive investigation about anything ever. And you think somebody in the vicinity would have been asked a couple of questions.
Well, I thought I'd be interviewed by the Warren Commission. I never was. None of the agents that were in that follow-up her were ever interviewed. I expected to be. I didn't want to be. I only for the fact that I knew I'd break down. This was way too traumatic for me. I carried all that trauma and the traumatic stress with me for years afterwards.
I'm sure. Obviously having an effect on you pretty quickly, because didn't you resign from the Secret Service within the year of the assassination?
I was feeling so badly, and I told myself, if I'm not feeling better in 6 months, I have to leave the Secret Service. It was just, I felt I was becoming, I was a liability to the service, I felt. I could not get over seeing the president's head explode in Daley Plaza. It played over and over in my mind, just like the looped tape of his head exploding.
Yeah.
And I thought if I left, that would all, I'd be leaving that behind. But I didn't realize I'd be carrying that with me for so many months or years afterwards.
I cannot imagine how hard it must have been for you in your effort to achieve what you just said, like getting away from it and not thinking about that fatal moment, when every year, almost without exception, there's another new theory as to what happened.
That's true, but after this whole time, I didn't read anything.
You calls for some speculation here, Paul. Who do you think did it?
Well, I don't know for sure. I think I think all the evidence that they have up to the fight was Oswald. I heard 3 shots. They found 3 cartridge cases in the school book depository. They found Oswald's rifle with his handprint on it.
Jackie Kennedy had been your assignment prior to that, and I assume after that until you left. Talk about your relationship with her and how difficult this was for her. One I can't even imagine.
It was sad times. It was hard. But we would be driving her somewhere, and I'd be driving. I hear the stops from the back seat of the car, and that was kind of painful. And I wanted to speak up and say something, but it wasn't my place to do that.
A lot of people have asked, well, why did you wait 60 years to tell the story and tell us some things that we hadn't even previously heard about? There are people that say he's misremembering. It didn't happen this way. It couldn't have happened this way. Is that part of the reason you didn't say anything for so long? Because you thought you didn't want to open yourself up to being dissected by the public?
I didn't wait. It just happened. I wasn't refusing to do anything for any particular reason. It's just where I went through the grieving and the healing process. But it took me that long before I really wanted to read anything or talk about it. It just turned out to be 60 years. I wasn't speaking out because there was something I was hiding. It was just the way things worked out.
This is the Theme Machine. I'm John Carney, and it's the Kennedys this time. Aside from conspiracy theories about assassinations, authors have also been enamored with the women that the Kennedy men have been involved with. Some, but not much, has been written about the relationship between Bobby and his brother's widow, Jackie, until David Hayman published Bobby and Jackie, a love story, in 2009.
I mean, I found out about the relationship while I was doing A Woman Named Jackie, which was published in '89. But at the time, Jackie was still very much alive. People didn't want to go on the record and talk about it. And, people obviously, the fact, extraordinarily intrigued by this family.
Set this up, and as the book does so well, it starts with them trying to pick up the pieces after one loses a brother and one loses a husband, tragically in an assassination.
Exactly. I mean, it was almost biblical in its context, or let's put it like this, it could have been Romeo and Juliet, because it was a ill-fated romance that could never end in a marriage. I mean, Bobby's political career, as did all of the Kennedy boys, came first before any woman. And in many respects, they were drawn together by commonly shared grief, but grief to such an extent that really Bobby had stopped being able to work as Attorney General under Lyndon Johnson, a man whom he loathed. In fact, it was Bobby who initially opposed the JFK's decision to appoint Lyndon Johnson as his running mate. And that enmity between these two men, Johnson and Bobby Kennedy, never terminated, never came to an end. And so he stopped going into the office in the Justice Department, working down the hall, by the way, from another man he loathed, J. Edgar Hoover, and who loathed him, the director of the FBI. I mean, Bobby was a man who wore his emotions on his sleeve as opposed to JFK, who was much more suave and debonair about the whole thing, who would smile at your face and stick it to you beyond your back, as P.S. Salinger said. I mean, he was much more the political animal than Bobby. And it was Ethel, in fact, who almost seemed to condone this relationship, amazingly enough, because it was she, at one point, about 9 months after JFK's death, who suggested to Bobby look, I'll go to Aspen with the kids. I mean, they had a brood at that point of 10 children. And you go off on a vacation in the Caribbean with Jackie and Lee, Jackie's sister, Lee Radswell, and Chuck Spaulding, who was a close family friend. Indeed, off they trotted to Montego Bay in Jamaica, the house of Audrey Zorderer, a well-known socialite of the day. And as Audrey said to me, I mean, there were 3 bedrooms, one for Chuck Spaulding, one for Lee Radswell, and then Bobby and Jackie occupied the third, in which there was one king-size bed, and as she put it, you could hear the sounds of their love-making all night long. So this evidently was the beginning of what one might call nature taking its course. And it continued basically until early 1968, when Bobby announced his bid for the presidency and realized, being advised by aides and close friends, that if he continued this relationship, that would mean certainly the end of any hope he had of becoming president. And by mutual consent, the relationship ended, though in many respects, they both, in the end, were bonded by these terrible, tragic events. But here was this, lady married to JFK, a man who was even then known for his womanizing, even after marrying Jackie. I mean, even on their honeymoon in 1953, for example, in Acapulco, Mexico, I interviewed a young lawyer who was present at a reception for the Kennedys, and Jack left Jackie standing on a veranda holding a cocktail and disappeared into a back bedroom with some young senorita he met at the party. And of course, I mean, Jackie expected this. Her father was Black Jack Bouvier, a well-known New York roulette, playboy, etc. But I think, like many women in a similar position, she thought she could change her husband, and she never could. Every time you think the book is closed on them, there's another chapter, be it JFK's assassination in 63, Bobby's less than 5 years later, Chappaquiddick in 1969, and on and on and on. John Jr.'s death in an airplane crash in 1999, Jackie's death in 94.
Let's not leave out William Kennedy Smith.
I mean, to say nothing of the rape trial of William Kennedy Smith and Michael Kennedy smashing into a tree while playing football, skiing down the slopes of Aspen, or David Kennedy, who died at the Brasilia Port Hotel in Palm Beach from an overdose of drugs. I mean, every time, as I say, you think this book is closed, there's a new chapter.
I think what is so shocking about these types of stories, especially of presidential infidelities, is the fact that
anticipating the fact that there may be some Thomas doubters among the public, I taped each and every interview that I conducted, and these interviews are available at the State University of New York at Stony Brook and in the Special Collections Department. I mean, we're talking here about more than 100 people who, were privy to this relationship.
That day, this wasn't really reported on. How was it not picked up by anyone?
I can't answer that except to say that people who were close to them all knew about the relationship, including, employees, including, Secret Service agents who were assigned to the Jackie and her children's detail. I mean, I got their reports 2 years ago, and it made it quite clear that Bobby was spending nights at her apartment on 45th Avenue in Manhattan. He was, at that point, senator from New York. He was spending more time with Jackie than he was with Ethel. It's a very psychologically complex situation, I think.
See David Hayman on the Theme Machine. And when I started to put this special together, I promised myself 2 things. One, it wasn't going to be just about who killed JFK, which, by the way, is also the name of a great podcast by Rob Reiner. And secondly, this wasn't going to just be about who slept with whom. David Talbot, who founded Salon.com, has long written about the Kennedy clan. So to turn over rocks that hadn't been turned over already could not have been an easy task.
The whole institution that is Camelot has been dissected, 50 different ways. Yet this angle very different in the book, talking about more about the political strategies of the two of them together.
Yeah, a very unique combination, these two brothers, and one we haven't seen before or since.
being siblings, there would be a common thread. They're both in the same party. They both got the same thing going. But is this like a blown-up sibling rivalry that caused some problems between the two of them?
No. John, Jack, and Bobby were absolutely devoted to each other, and there was no rivalry or tension there. You know, what they were trying to do was, I think, rethink America's place in the world, nothing short of that. The Kennedy presidency was a government at war with itself, being torn apart from within over the Cold War, with John Kennedy and a small circle of trusted people, including Bobby Kennedy, trying to lead the country out of the nuclear death match that we were in with the Soviet Union that had put the whole world at risk, particularly during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when, you know, the world was on the brink of destruction. And also move us out of the terrible racial conflicts that were ripping apart the country in those years. And I think, you know, there were a lot of high stakes, which is what Bobby Kennedy, the president's devoted younger brother and attorney general, thought really happened in Dallas to his brother, the president. And I wanted to track Bobby's footsteps because he was one of the great investigators of his day to find out what he truly thought had happened in Dallas.
He didn't have much time. I mean, there wasn't a big lapse of time, 6 months between the assassination of both of them.
Absolutely. Bobby's days were numbered. And I think Bobby, particularly after the death of his brother, felt had a very fatalistic sense of life. Even his decision to run for president in 1968, which carried such great risks and dangers. He knew whoever had killed his brother, because he believed JFK was the victim of a conspiracy, he knew those same people, those same forces were out there waiting for him and did not want him to get back to the White House, because Bobby Kennedy was determined to reopen the investigation into his brother's death.
Was Robert openly in discord with that, or did he say that later and in privacy?
In private, he painfully wrestled with the question of what should he do. Should he cooperate with the Warren investigation? He didn't believe it was a truly independent investigation. He knew it was in the control of people who had been poisonous enemies of the Kennedy presidency, namely J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, and Allen Dulles, the deposed head of the CIA. Remember, President Kennedy had fired Allen Dulles, head of the CIA. Bobby Kennedy knew with Dulles and Hoover running that investigation, it was not going to be truly credible. But he knows he has a terrific political and public relations problem. If he says that he doesn't believe the Warren report, then he opens up a huge can of worms. It's going to, he fears, tear apart the country. So what Bobby Kennedy does is very Bobby Kennedy-like. He keeps his own counsel. He was not a foolish man. He knew how power worked. And he decides that he's going to privately look into the assassination of his brother using a number of people he trusted, former FBI investigator Walter Sheridan, among others, journalists he trusted. And he was going to bide his time. And he was hoping to get back to the White House, where he would continue his brother's disrupted presidency and then reopen the investigation into his death.
That's David Talbot, who chronicled many of the battles that JFK and his brother faced within their own administration. And as we learned, it led to some interesting measures that were taken by the president. Here's David again.
Interesting story, too, of JFK, who we know had ties to Hollywood and ran with some of the movie folks of that day. But it was that tie to Hollywood that, at Kennedy's urging, actually is what prompted Hollywood to make Manchurian Candidate.
Yeah, amazing story, which I dug up. Again, you know, a lot of attention on Jack, as you say, and Marilyn and all of that. But I wanted to know what was going on with Hollywood and JFK in a different way. The president and his administration began to feel so isolated, began to feel really that there might be the danger of a coup, a military coup, overthrowing him because of these hardliners felt that he was going soft on the Soviet Union and Cuba. And so he turned to his friend, movie director John Frankenheimer, who had directed Manchurian Candidate, a film that JFK had encouraged or helped his friend Frank Sinatra get off the ground. And he asked Frankenheimer, will you make a film version of the best-selling novel of the day, 7 Days in May? Well, of course, that novel was inspired by Curtis LeMay, this crazy general who ran the Air Force, and was about an attempted military coup in Washington aimed at a Kennedy-like president. What JFK was attempting to do, according to those like Arthur Schlesinger, one of his aides who I interviewed, was to warn the American people by getting that movie made, that this could happen in real life, that this could happen in Washington, because I am trying to go against this hardline national security apparatus that is dead set on continuing the Cold War.
All things that I have read that speculate as to why JFK was assassinated. Cuba probably comes up more than anything else because a lot of those people that you had mentioned who wanted to go in there and take out Castro and that regime really saw John as a traitor when he publicly said, we are not going to use military force in this conflict.
That's right. That was the breaking point, I think, within the Kennedy presidency, and it came early. Cuba was the Iraq of its day. It was where all these Cold War tensions were swirling around, and the hardliners desperately wanted to take out Fidel Castro, and they wanted to do it militarily. John Kennedy had run on quite a militant platform, saying that Cuba should be liberated, as he put it. And when he didn't follow through after the Bay of Pigs, they felt betrayed, these hardliners. And the chasm within the administration grew more and more after that. You know, there were various clandestine efforts to overthrow the Castro government. Some people believe that the Kennedys approved the CIA mafia plots to kill Castro that we now know about ever since the Church Committee in the 1970s revealed them. But I believe that Bobby Kennedy tried to shut down those CIA mafia plots. In fact, was outraged that the CIA, an arm of the United States government, would be dealing with organized crime that way. You know, Bobby Kennedy had come into public life in the 1950s as an investigator looking into organized crime for the Senate Rackets Committee. So the idea that his own government would be doing business with the mob outraged him. And I believe that on the afternoon of his brother's assassination, that's where Bobby immediately cast his suspicion. He thought this plot against the president had come out of the CIA mafia operation.
So what happened to his investigation upon Robert's death?
That's such a terrible day. It ends so much in America, as you know, when Bobby, the second Kennedy, the Kennedy who so many of us thought that everything was riding on him, not only the investigation into his brother's assassination, but the Vietnam War, civil rights, bringing the country together again.
You know, you had made reference to Bobby feeling like he was a marked man, like his time was numbered, and I forgot exactly how you verbalized it, but it was perfect. Did he chronicle that? Did he publicly go on record stating that he was in fear for his life?
He never did, because the Kennedy way is never to really acknowledge fear, you know?
Well, yeah, Ted gets a brain tumor and goes sailing the next day.
Exactly. That's the Kennedy way. And they were raised like that by the old man, Joe Kennedy, you know, don't show fear. And Bobby himself would say often that courage was the greatest human trait. And he, I think, in some ways envied his older brother's experiences in World War II, even though his oldest brother, Joe Kennedy, of course, lost his life there. He was too young to get into action in World War II, and I think Bobby, the rest of his life, was trying to prove himself in some way, taking on organized crime, taking on these mobsters, challenging one even at one point to a fist fight when he was going after them. You know, he was fearless in many ways, but of course, he knew what he was facing when he announced for president in 1968. As I said, whoever he thought had killed his brother was still out there. He knew when he waded into those crowds with no Secret Service protection in those days for presidential candidates, he knew that he was putting his life on the line every day that he campaigned. And so the enormous physical courage it must have taken for that man to do what he did. We know that before he went out and gave speeches during that campaign in 1968, he was so torn up that he would throw up sometimes backstage. So we know that he knew that those demons were still out there.
This is the Theme Machine. I'm John Carney. This time around, the focus has been on the Kennedys. Hope you enjoyed it. Next time, we switch gears entirely and bring you funny people from across the pond. Not a very good name, is it? Let's just call it English Jokesters. Neil Innes, Eddie Izzard, and of course, some pythons. The Theme Machine has been duct taped together by Everett Marshall Creative. Be sure to stop by our website for more information and more inside tracks. Be sure to follow our socials as well. I'm John Carney. Thanks for listening. Be good to each other.